Well, it's just turned 4:30 my time. I'm in Stockholm, Sweden. So let's kick off today's session. And I want to first, of course, welcome everyone to this kind of inaugural event that we're hosting in collaboration with the International Society for the Circular Economy and, of course, and Getting in the Loop podcast. And we're having a panel discussion today on the topic of circular consumption, question mark. And we have a bit of a panel discussion planned initially, where I will moderate some questions to the panelists. And then the idea is to take a short pause and we'll resume for some audience Q&A. But we'll see exactly how long that this lasts, but it kind of depends on the questions from the audience and how much of a discussion that we have going. And for those of you who don't know, my name is Catherine Whalen, or I go by Katie, and I'm a researcher in sustainable business at RISE, which is the Research Institutes of Sweden. And I also host a podcast where I interview people on circular economy, and that's called Getting in the Loop. And you can listen to the podcast if you're interested on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or basically any podcast platform or online. So from me, now it's time to welcome Juana, Katarina third. We have Paul Rogers, and last but not least, we have Franska Vandenberg, or from the mountain, as we were chatting earlier. So welcome to this wonderful panel. I'm very excited and so happy that you could join us today to kick off this inaugural seminar, where we're going to dive into the topic of circular consumption. And we have a lot to unpack today. And as I said, we'll have about 30 minutes or so of some questions that I have pre-prepared, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. But I also would encourage that members of the audience to already send in questions into the chat box as you think of things. So don't wait until the end of sort of the moderated discussion. So I would like to direct a first question to kick us off, actually. Could you tell us a little bit more about what leads people to discarding products?
I think it's very valuable to open up this about how we consume it. I think this is very important. It lasts now for 10 years. I don't see the value anymore in a repair of this product. So I simply buy a new one because it's made its money worth. Furthermore, we can see that by, for example, new introductions of features on the market, these can be very incremental, but create new desires for consumers to buy new products. For example, an additional camera on the phone, and seeing advertisement of this. Just basically, people want new things that provide them new epistemic value, how we phrase it in our paper we recently published in the article in the Journal of Current Opinion in Psychology. So these needs are evolving and also cause people to replace products that actually could have functioned or used longer. And lastly, we also observe that replacement is an easy choice for the consumer. It's like seamlessly orchestrated by the resellers, that if you just buy one or two clicks, you can just get a new one the day after in your house delivered, for example, a washing machine when it breaks down. And if we look at repair services, they are less developed. You cannot really, it's difficult to find them. And also, more importantly, maybe, they are still quite expensive, while delivery of replacement services are now for free and readily available. So that causes also people to replace it instead of considering a repair. And furthermore, we have little understanding of products. Becomes less and less. The product is glued together. You cannot see any screws anymore on the, for example, on the phone. How to open it up, and facts like physical. I'm now talking about the physical factors that could stimulate a repair on a product. So we know less and less how products work, which is also not encouraging any repair. So we do not understand what is wrong. We do not want to invest the time.
You mentioned washing machines, you mentioned phones, and I also know that you have looking a lot into like fast moving goods.
You know, like health products, beauty products, packaged foods, beverages. We're often throwing them away just as part of a kind of more habitual and subconscious process. They're products that we buy and we use and we dispose of in really, really quick succession and very frequently. So there's a quick turnaround, and once we've consumed those items, we tend to leave behind a component that facilitates the consumption, packaging, for example, which then no longer has a function at all, and therefore becomes valueless or is thrown away as waste. So I think that's worth kind of noting, there are these differences between product categories that appear. And then your second question was about the approaches or the models that maybe are promising to changing those behaviors. And I think one of the biggest problems that I see in this transition from linear to circular consumption is the perceived level of effort and inconvenience faced by consumers for them to close resource loops. So for example, they have to take end-of-life resources to a specific place, a shop, a street side, deposit site, to be intercepted, to be recovered. And that seems like a lot of effort on the behalf of a consumer, given that they can just throw it away in the bin at home, which is partly why something like doorstep recycling, whilst I acknowledge it needs improvements, through better symbols for correct waste disposal, it's been particularly successful. It continues to fit with that narrative, I think, of a throwaway culture, of the current consumption model that exists. I think that it's that triggering step where we can then change attitudes and pave the path to perhaps more complex or sophisticated circular models that maybe require that higher level of motivation or effort down the line.
Mm-hmm. So, and that's I don't know if I'm good, BJ or BF fog from Stanford. Is that the model that you're referring to, Kat?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So how do you take things that become already almost habitual to, let's say, discard, or I heard the word divest the other day as well. Like, how do you make that a bit more habitual? Which kind of leads to discussions of what Juana was saying in terms of changing the consumption process and designing more circular offerings. I'm curious, Paul, for your work, you have done a lot of investigation in how to kind of influence, I would say, behavior. Could you give us an insight into one of the factors that you think is currently not being sufficiently addressed?
I don't think attitudes are biases personally. I think they're different things. But things like attitude, biases and heuristics, and the impact that has on both consumption and disposal, I think needs more research.
Mm-hmm. And Juana, would you like to pick up on that based on what Paul has said about the lack of experimental factors, for example?
Yeah, one thing that I found is that yes, there is lack of there hasn't been much research on addressing biases, because most of the theories that have supported research in these topics have come from economics and psychology, and less work has been done from sociological perspectives that address this kind of biases or look at these abnormalities in rational behavior from a deeper perspective. And because of that, most of the research has not considered infrastructure, contextual factors that influence behavior. So, of course, understanding how one individual behaves and looking into those factors are important, but most of those factors are shaped by context. So how do we understanding context, and because it is context that provides the ability for consumers to perform certain factors are is very scarce yet. And I think that's one of the areas that we need to look into when we're talking about consumption in the circular economy. How changing contextual factors influence the behavior of the consumer or the user.
Contextual factors. Could you give maybe another example of what you mean by this?
So when you're thinking of contextual factors, a theory that has been used very often or recently is practice theory, where it talks about, okay, we have the images, we have the means, and we have the rules. So infrastructure is a contextual factor, an individual behavior perspective.
Mm-hmm. And if I now, of course, I'm simplifying it, but kind of what I'm hearing from you, there's also seems to be this question of, do consumers even need to know that they're consuming in a way that leads towards a circular economy? So I'd like to ask, maybe we can go around through the panel and get your opinions on this, because I think this might be a diversive kind of question. But maybe we can first, Renske, you could give your thoughts on that.
I think that's a very interesting question, also where I want to focus more future research on. What do consumers need to know whether they should act sustainable or not? I think from what I found in my study is that people do not really consider durability or longevity of the product because information is not provided to them. So the resellers do not talk about this. So they base their purchase decision more on previous experiences they had with the products, the reputation of the brand, and the initial price. And especially this price can be very much influenced by deals and discounts. So for example, for electronic products or household goods, when you have a good deal, you tend to go towards that. While actually, maybe when they were more informed about where these products were produced, how they were produced, it could have influenced them. And I think from the interview study we did, they indicated that they could have been influenced by that. So that's indicating that we do need to, for example, buy the more expensive product that's more sustainable. We have to seek that trigger the people more on, for example, convenience or more monetary incentives. We have to find those, take these into account if we really want to reach the big audience, in my opinion. So it's something to further be explored.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that reflection, Renske. I'd like to direct the same question to Paul now as well. If we are looking at creating sort of this ideal circular economy, do consumers need, or let's say users or customers, do they need to be aware?
I think it's just the moralistic argument that whether they should know what they're doing or be informed when you ask the question. I mean, you know,
sorry, go on.
50% off labels is one very simple way of choice architecture, isn't it? You're trying to encourage people to buy the cheaper product. But there's other more subtle ways of doing it, I would say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Kat, I wanted to have you also have the chance to answer this question. We've now had some different perspectives on it, including the moralistic perspective. But what are your thoughts in terms of customers and users being aware of circular economy rather than being sort of nudged in that direction?
I think it's an interesting question. I think so there's kind of different perspectives that you can come at it from. I think in terms of whether consumers are buying products for their sustainability credentials or other factors is something to be aware of. But I think there's also this issue of or potential issue that comes up of greenwashing. If we're over labeling products with these green messages, or covering them in environmental messaging with little depth, or perhaps not enough truth to them, then that's an issue. I also think that the number of eco-devoted consumers is very low.
Now I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Is there something you would like to add to the discussion?
Yes, that's a question that we had from the very beginning of our PhD, and we discussed with Weston Baxter at Imperial. I don't know, Katrina, if you met him. But then that question comes, I mean, it has a very important moralistic perspective. So should people know? Well, remanufacturing and secondhand products have, I mean, there are laws and regulations that make providers or business inform people that their parts have been remanufactured, because they have higher risks. They have had higher risks. As long as the companies and the industry becomes better at guaranteeing safety, I guess there will be a point where people do not need to know, because everything is going to be remanufactured. But because of safety issues, you should inform companies, and it also depends on the product. Consumers. It also depends on the product category, and it's related to safety. I also think that, yes, you can nudge people to choose the more circular perspective, but then the challenge there is to decide what is more circular. Who decides what is more circular? And that's the criticism against design for sustainable behavior, that says, okay, but who is the designer to decide what is sustainable or not? Yes, there's science, and we expect people to be able to avoid greenwashing or circular washing. So I think we should tell people what they are buying, and when we reach the point where everything is safe and it's circular, then it's not needed. But I would go more for the moralistic argument, which is not something that we discuss enough in the circular economy group, or the politics of the circular economy, the ethics of the circular economy, the risks, the social risks of the circular economy.
This sounds like a discussion for a follow-up seminar. Recommend one source.
So I was thinking that, generally speaking, I'd obviously go to the literature databases, the online databases, if people have access to that. So things like PsycInfo, Business Source, that sort of thing. In terms of the circular economy, I particularly like the book by Wheatman, which is a handbook of the circular economy, and there's a new version of that coming out, if not later this year, then early next year. In terms of acceptance, I'm embarrassed to say, should we say, that I was going to say Juana's review paper really helped me. So I would, in terms of general circular acceptance, that. In terms of the psychology of ownership more generally, which is some of the things I'm interested in, there's a nice little book by Bruce Hood, who's come out, I think, last year, called, I've got it here, actually, called Possession. If you're interested in this sort of developmental psychology of it, Philip Rocher has written a book in 2014 about the psychological, the knowledge children have of ownership and sharing. And then any paper by Russell Belk or Floyd Rudman, I think it's Rudman, yeah, or Woman, they look at the psychology of ownership in a much sort of deeper level. Finally, I would say that in terms of psychological ownership, the area I'm particularly looking at, there's a nice review paper by Drusilla and colleagues in 2015. And if you're really feeling flushed, there's a quite expensive book, I shouldn't say that, by Peck and Shu, who wrote a book called, what is it called now? It's called something like Psychological Ownership for Consumer Behaviour 2018, and that covers all possible aspects, ironically, except for access-based consumption, which is where I'm going down. So, I mean, hopefully there's a few there. One final one, there's a very nice book by Sundar Harajan, I think it's pronounced, on the sharing economy, which goes into great depth about that. So there's a whole range of different sources depending on what you're looking for there. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Okay. And thank you.
I can give you the references for those if anybody asks. Yeah.
That would be great. We can see how we can communicate that to everyone. What a great list. Kat, do you have one recommended resource?
Yeah, so I would also say just general literature databases if you have access to those, of course. But then I'm going to go with probably the most obvious, probably everyone is already aware of who's listening, but it's not necessarily consumption focused, but I think with the Ellen MacArthur website, it's really great for, you know, just a massive overview of learning resources for education, design toolkits, learning hubs. They've kind of got lots of stuff there if you're also looking just to start expanding your knowledge in that space. I think they're good as well because their own research is looking, yes, a lot at business implementation, but also now extending to consider users in a circular economy. So their report on reuse, for example, it's quite high level for sure, but it's a good introduction into thinking about FMCG reuse, especially. Something I would like to see, which I don't think exists. Maybe one of you can correct me if you have a resource to hand, that'd be amazing. But I know there's lots of platforms that offer sustainability analyses or comparisons of products and brands in other categories, or like Fashion Revolution have a kind of big transparency index. But I haven't come across one or an equivalent one for circular product assessment or recommendation. And I think that would be really useful or beneficial in helping consumers to make more informed choices for circularity. So yeah, if any of you have anything that springs to mind, that would be really good to hear about.
Any ideas from our other panelists, or maybe it's something that we need to be working on in the future? Juana, a recommended resource.
So for circular design from a user perspective, I would recommend Use to Use tool from Chalmers. Yeah, I don't know if you know Annelie Selvefors, but they launched last year their tool to design circular solutions, but from a user perspective. The website is use2use.se, and it's very good. It's very well developed. From a literature perspective, I would recommend to read Julie Shore, The Sharing Economy. She has a critical perspective to the sharing economy from the user's perspective and more sociological perspective. And finally, to understand how practices change over time, social practices change, I would recommend Elizabeth Shoves and colleagues' book from 2012, The Dynamics of Social Practices. It's very interesting and it's kind of easy to understand. So those are my 3 to-go resources. And my PhD thesis, Redrawing the Circle.
Excellent, withdrawing, yes, excellent. And your, well, I guess your literature review, but also it's probably mentioned in your PhD thesis as well. So, and we, of course, Renska, if you could give us a recommended resource. And one thing that I noticed is people are asking if it's possible to post this in the chat maybe. So feel free to add your recommendations in the chat. But Renska.
Yeah, I can recommend some. Yeah, just for me, it really helped to get a full understanding of the total circular economy as well. I would recommend to follow a MOOC, which is also quite nice to listen to, and you get some assignments. Yeah, it's also stimulating yourself to learn, and maybe when you're a researcher and you're sitting all by yourself, maybe a MOOC can be nice. So I followed this MOOC preceding my PhD about circular economy, Sustainable Materials Matters, I think the name was, on Coursera. It helped me a lot to get a full understanding of the circular economy. So if you want to learn more about that, that's interesting, I think, to to do. And also, I think it's also translated now in English, but there's a nice a book from Babette Porcelein. It's called Verborgen Impact. It's translated to Hidden Impact, to the hidden impact of products in the circular economy. And more specifically related to my topic about replacement, I would recommend to read Van Ness and Kramer's research. It's quite already old, it's 15 years ago, but I think still it's quite relevant to look further into if you want to know more about replacement behavior. So those are my recommendations.
Excellent. Thank you, Renske. Is that the MOOC? Was it a big consortium? I wonder if it's the one that Lund University was.
Yes.
Okay.
I think it was, yeah.
Then
find it very nice.
Excellent. I was. You might have seen a lecture by me, actually.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah.
Yeah, we had some fun putting that together. Okay, so we've had one question really coming in from Lisa to the panelists. I would invite other people to also add questions to the chat. So the question, I would like to direct this to Paul, and the question is, I would be interested to know what the panelists' opinions are on the ways that startup circular businesses might be enabled to create if they do not have full information on circular economy through consumerism. I'm trying to also understand this question. Maybe Lisa, if you're there, if you're willing to ask this question and come on audio, we can also arrange for you to be unmuted. Unless you understand the question, Paul.
No, I don't. No, you're talking about startups, which is not really my area, is it? That's business startups, presumably. So yeah. Maybe a clarification there would help, yeah.
Kat, you wanted to pick up on the question.
Yeah, I mean, feel free, Lisa, I think you asked it to clarify if I'm not taking it in the right direction, but I think the premise of the question is just kind of about how you build a circular business based on consumption if you don't have a huge awareness of that, or if you don't have a in-depth understanding of that in the first place. And it's not my specialism, so this is kind of just a casual answer, but I think first thing is that I think it's really great if you're in that position to begin thinking about how we design and build systems as opposed to just that singular product. So thinking about that product at different phases in the consumption cycle is also really important. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm not sure if it was the direction of the question, but.
If I may contribute, yes. Following on that, Katrina just posted they used to use design tool that helps you understand how to think a product, a normal value proposition from a circular perspective and a user perspective. So what we need to understand first is how these circular principles applying the circular principles, how do they change the offerings, the linear offerings, and how do they affect the consumption process? And then that's where you can find opportunities for new services or for new offerings that as a startup you can provide to your customers. So it is important to, even if you don't have much information about circular economy, what you need to be aware of is solving your customers' needs or requirements by creating the offering in a circular way. And I think that when you think of a business model, the value proposition is always going to be the same. That's not going to change if it's circular or not circular. The way you deliver or create that value is what changes. You can do it linearly or you can do it circular. So that's why you need to change designed differently when you're creating your business model? The way you deliver value or the way you create value?
Excellent answer.
Can I just add to that a little bit then? Because I've been thinking about it as people have been talking.
Mhm.
From the literature that I've read, one of the best things for developing psychological ownership is to empower the consumer or the user. So if you've got a service or product service that you're trying to offer, get them involved early on in helping design what they want exactly. Make it sort of bespoke, if you like. And that way they develop more of an attachment or psychological ownership for that outcome, and therefore they're more likely to come back and be a returner. So it really depends on what the person was trying to offer, though. You know, if they're renting cars or selling, you know, knickknacks, it depends. But generally speaking, some sort of empowerment for the consumer would probably help, I would say. But,
Mhm. And you have an interesting, in your research of psychological ownership as well, Paul, it's quite interesting because there's a fine line between, you want consumers or users to be like attached to products, but for certain times you don't actually want them to be attached to products. Like for example, with the car leasing, then maybe you actually don't want them to be attached. Like you still want them to sort of give it back at the end. So what are the main sort of issues that you are seeing in relation to this idea of like, where is the fine line between attachment and not attachment for a circular economy?
I think we should change the word attachment, because material attachment is a different concept, it's a slightly narrower concept. Fine line. I mean, I think the idea is that you do want people to be psychologically owned to the things they're renting. And this is what I've been looking at. I've been looking at whether there is evidence for that. And initial studies said there was no evidence. People do not attach to rented products. But subsequent studies have suggested they do. So I think what marketers will want is people to attach to the products with an awareness that there is a time limitation. But of course, if you're renting a car, the renters will want you to come back and rent a different car. So it might be that you attach to the brand or the service and not the product. And as far as I know, there's only been one study looking at both the service and the product simultaneously, or rather the service, the brand and the product simultaneously. So there needs to be more research looking at that. It's not the product, it's the brand you're trying to attach them to, possibly. So yeah, I think it's maybe a shift of focus there.
Yes, that's quite a interesting realization, that you can maybe adjust it in terms of what you want them to actually become having this connection to. But I had a question that referred back to something we talked earlier in regards to communicating circularity to users. And there was a mention about like eco labels and also product characteristics to consumers. And this is something that I've also done a little bit in the work at Rise. This is what I'm working on a little bit. It just started to. And I wanted to ask Renske, have you looked into sort of ways to communicate circularity to users in your research at all?
Thank you for your question, Katie. Actually, that is what we are currently planning to do now, because we saw in literature that, and also from my recent study, I see that a lot of people look at, for example, the eco label on a product that's more related to the energy it consumes. So if it's status A, I don't know if it's the same in Sweden, but then it consumes less energy, and people really take that into account during decision making, because in the use phase it's more energy efficient. But we at the Prompt Project are interested in developing this label that's more about informing the consumers about the lifetime. So, and also in literature, the potential of a lifespan label is addressed. And by informing them more about, for example, the possibilities to repair, or give them a repair index and availability of spare parts, to make that required for large investment household goods or consumer electronics, people can take that into account during decision making. And
I'm curious, I'd like to ask Kat about this, and have you given any thoughts of what kind of information should be communicated to consumers?
Yeah, I think following on from Renska's comments on that kind of grading system, for example, or systems that exist already, maybe not comprehensively enough, but they are out there. I think those are quite important in that they provide a more quantitative analysis where there's kind of backing for those claims, that they've been tested, that they fit into those categories, that it's quite clear cut what consumers are choosing and what they're getting. So I think that's important, as opposed to, I guess going back to what I was saying about this kind of potential or possibility of greenwashing by making these broad sweeping statements that don't have that level of research and that level of confirmation that they do actually have those qualities. So I think that is really important. I think clarity in symbols is something that's really important. I guess that follows on from that comment, but I know, I still live in shared accommodation, and I see, for example, how bad people are at simply recycling in a household bin. And I think that's because we have, at the moment in the UK anyway, the labels are pretty ambiguous. They kind of say either to check your local recycling point or that they're widely recycled. So I think we're moving beyond that, and they're now implementing ones that either say recycled or not recyclable, just so it's very clear, and you have to give that level of clarity in order for people to perform the required or the necessary behaviour, recycling, reuse, whatever it is. I think you're on mute, Katie.
Yeah, I knew that was going to happen at some point. Thank you for the reminder, and thank you for the response, Kat. I want to just double check that there's any questions in the chat box just now from our attendees, or if there's an attendee who would like to actually ask a question, and then I think they can either unmute themselves or I can unmute them. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? I'd like to just give a little second to make sure. We have one from Patricia in the chat. If you could recommend effective LCA tools. Any of the panelists, do you have a recommendation?
OpenLCA is good, and CIMA Pro and Gabi.
Yeah. Okay.
OpenLCA is open, so.
I've never carried out an LCA myself, but I know I've communicated with businesses who use a tool called Treyaq, TREYAK analysis. So I can put that in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Juana and Kat. So we have another question from Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, for your questions. She says, where I live, recycling is still considered as one of the main principles of circular economy. What do you find as the most important circular economy principle to ensure future engagement for consumers, and why, i.e. repair, reuse, remanufacturing? And I'd like to direct this question first to Paul, if you'd like to.
Well, I mean, if you look at the butterfly diagram, it'll be repair, wouldn't it? But for me, I think it may well be remanufacturing. I think the presentation of products as being as good as new or even better than new through remanufacturing and reuse of materials, I think will probably be the way forward more so. I mean, we have reuse a lot anyway. I used to be a record collector as a youngster, and buy loads of secondhand records and loads of secondhand clothes, and probably still do. So I mean, some of these things are not new exactly, but I think remanufacturing would be the novel one for me. So I think that would be the most important of the four R's. Having said that, I'm currently looking at, about to start some research on looking at the perceived impact of the 4Rs by comparing them in an experimental design. So once I get the data for that, I'll be able to talk about that. That could be some weeks though, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. I think the remanufacturing is quite interesting, and it leads into this provocative kind of question that I've just received from someone about, could a CE exist without worrying too much about explicit consumer engagement, i.e. does it make more sense around business to business and kind of resource efficiency related to business? And I guess this is also kind of fits in with the remanufacturing, Paul. So let's see, Juana, would you like to have a response to this?
The question is why to worry about B2C instead of focusing on B2B?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think it's either one or the other. We have to work on both sides. And as I mentioned, circularity happens on the value creation and value delivery side of things, either if it's B2B or B2C. So how do we perform the activities? But of course, for specific types of business models like access-based and recirculated, consumption is also working with the consumer, and how we communicate the value proposition is important. So I think we don't have to say, okay, I mean, we can start with remanufacture with the B2B, and that has happened for over 20 years, more than 20 years, but as we see, it's not enough. So we do need, and it's not enough in developed countries. It's even not enough in developing countries where consumption, I mean, we don't have industries. So if we don't work with B2C in developing countries there, then we're not going to have a resource efficient economy. So I think we have started with B2B. We have to improve that, but we definitely need to move to B2C. And we have to start now, because if we don't start changing from now, then we're going to be locked into linear practices.
Yes, and it kind of loops back around to what we also started this discussion with in terms of differences in like the developing countries versus the non-developing countries. So yeah, I think I would like to see if there's any final questions from the audience right now. But I thought it might be nice to end if there's any questions that the panelists have for each other that you would like to ask each other. I'd like to give you the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, if I can ask a question.
Go for it, Renska.
Yeah, I am actually curious because Katie, you sent around a couple of questions for us to get us already triggered into answering the questions for this panel discussion. And you asked us what kind of circular models or approaches you think are most promising to challenge this behavior. Personally, I saw some things like, for example, stimulate more care activities with products.
Especially like fast-moving consumer goods, where the turnaround is really quick, and it's a habit that we have. You know, we buy, use, and dispose of FMCGs pretty much every day. Of us, we're interacting with those things on a really regular basis. But now actually seeing starting to build in FMCG space, which I think is. It seems like an unusual application of it, but I think that's important to start thinking about how is it possible to sell services for something like an FMCG that seems like something that we use personally and then throw away. So I think that's something that is potentially promising. So yeah, this combination of product and service that then jointly fulfills the consumer need.
Yeah, and actually a question that I personally have about whether I have now currently more doubts and doubts whether product service systems can be the solution, because also addressing the psychological ownership, people feel less and less attached to the product, so maybe they behave more recklessly with those products, or even throw it away earlier, or do not really care. How do you think about this?
So I was actually going to direct a similar question to Paul when he opened it up to us. So Paul mentioned that it's about creating that psychological ownership feeling towards a product that we don't necessarily own. And you mentioned that one way of doing that is to create deeper connections that we have with brands as opposed to the product, maybe. And I was thinking, as you were talking about it, that it's also about, it's about this relationship that we have with the provider of the service, and the emotional kind of connection and attachment we have to that, as opposed to, again, this product. But I don't know if you have any more insights on ways that you can create that ownership for products that you no longer own, Paul.
It depends, I think, on the motive for your ownership motives. I mean, there are basically four. There's the ability to control an object or your environment. There's the expression of self-identity. There is a chance to be stimulated by being entertained. And then there's this thing called having a place to dwell, this sense of being familiar or belonging. And each one of the various mechanisms for psychological ownership can have a different impact depending on which motive you're looking at. So in terms of some of the products you'd be looking at for a car, for example, it depends whether you're motivated by having that car represent your self-identity, a sports car, for example, as opposed to being more functional. So I think in terms of how to create stronger sense of psychological ownership, it depends on what motive you're looking at, and also which particular route you're trying to go down, whether you're trying to create a sense of control, create a sense of intimate knowledge, or create a sense of self-investment. The problem with those three concepts is, although they're independent, they are massively overlapping as well. So it's very difficult at the moment to try and think of something where you have more intimate knowledge but less self-investment. So on a theoretical level, it's quite difficult at the moment to do that. In terms of giving things back, I mean, is it true that you work with Western? I can't remember now. Who's at Imperial? Somebody's at Imperial. It's you. Yeah. So Western has come up with what is called trajectories of relinquishment, and he suggests there are 4 different methods of relinquishing goods. One of which is a sudden relinquishment, when a product is just completely dysfunctional, and the other ones are more general, once your psychological ownership needs are being met either slowly or very slowly. So there's models there that Western has come up with, but they haven't been empirically tested as far as I'm aware. So that's where some more research is needed. I don't know if that's answered your question, but
to me, it seems like there's a bit of, you said, Paul, about the motives for people and sort of designing for different motives. Like, could we also use the same word, like user needs? Is that, do you see that being the same, or is it a bit different? Are these motives like values that people have more?
That's a conceptual question, isn't it, really? I mean
we're researchers here, so
yeah. I mean needs or motives. I would tend to go with the idea that they're slightly different, although off the top of my head trying to define the two would be difficult. I would suggest possibly that needs may be more conscious than motives. The idea that these motives are almost innate. Some of the research by Rochat in his book talks about the fact that children as young as a few months old are aware of the concept of ownership, even though they have no language. So the idea is that a lot of our ownership needs are if they're not innate, they're instilled in us at a very, very early age. And this is one of the issues that maybe the circular economy has to try and deal with. You know, the fact that the need for ownership, or the motive for ownership, is so ingrained in us. Will we ever let go of that fully?
That is quite a big question, and I think I would like to end the discussion here on that note. And I would like to say thank you to all of the panelists for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge, and of course for sharing the resources in the chat. Maybe you can just go around quickly and say where people can connect with you. Where would you prefer people to connect with you, or if you're willing to have people connect with you, where they can find they can find you. So Renska, where would you like people to get in touch with you?
Of course, you can also always approach me on LinkedIn and send me a private message. And otherwise, I can also send my email address in the chat. So if you would like to have any more follow-up questions related to my research on replacement and stimulation of the pair, then yeah, I'm happy to answer your questions.
Brilliant. Hannah? Where would be the best place for people to reach out? Is that LinkedIn?
Yeah, LinkedIn is fine. I'm always checking it, so just send me a message and I will answer as quickly as I can.
Excellent. And Kat, continue.
Yeah, equally, LinkedIn is great. If you have any other questions that you want to send over to me, happy to answer those. Also, Imperial website, you can get my email address from there as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Paul, is there a place you'd like people to reach out?
Yeah, I think probably ResearchGate is the one I tend to. I don't do LinkedIn, so ResearchGate or my email address if people want it, but ResearchGate is probably the best.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, thank you all again for joining this discussion, and I'm going to try to give a brief summary of what we have discussed today. We have covered a lot of different ground. We started talking about how, well, Juana talked about the three sort of main areas of this consumption and circular economy that have been covered so far are about how to change the consumption process, what drives consumption, and also how to design circular offerings. And from there, we had a bit of a conversation about how could you maybe make, not make, but nudge users and people in a way that aligns with a circular actions. We had the discussion about, is that moral? So the idea of nudging, is this a moral issue if people are sort of acting in ways that we're encouraging them to act without their actual cognizant knowledge. And we also discussed about how choice architecture could be used in having consumers or users go for maybe more circular offerings. But one of the things with more circular offerings is, of course, who decides if it's more circular or not, right? So we have the question about, is it greenwashing or now what we call circular washing? So those are some of the key issues about deciding circularity and who decides if it's more circular. We talked about differences between different types of offers, so B2B and B2C, and we had the discussion that you probably would actually need to do both, especially considering if we want to include developing countries in the discussion around circular economy. And we also talked about different types of offerings that companies could have in terms of the enabling infrastructure that allows it to be almost habitual and easy for consumers to, you know, for example, leave the bottle of milk out for the door to be collected by the milkman. And also how to maybe get away from thinking about attachment to products because you can actually have attachment to the brand or the service. And there, of course, we have this question though, which we ended on, which is about ownership. As Paul pointed out, we are even very young. This idea of ownership is instilled in us. And so this could pose a challenge moving towards more circular offerings where we are supposed to sort of divest from products at the end of our usage with them. So with that, I would like to conclude the first monthly seminar for the International Society for Circular Economy. And I would like to invite you all to join on November 11th. So we have our next seminar, which the topic is still to be formally announced, but it's related to circular transitions. And yes, hope to see you all there. And if you have, of course, inputs, comments, suggestions on the format of this session, or also the topics that you would like to suggest for future sessions, then feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat as well, so you can all get in touch. So thank you, and round of applause for our speakers.